Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Josh Bland. Josh, how are you? It's great to finally have you on the show.
Yeah, I'm really good, thanks, mate, and likewise, it's really exciting to be here.
Yeah, it is. We've got a cracking episode lined up for this, actually. As I was just saying off air, I'm really excited to be speaking with you about this. Today we're going to be talking about how football is related to this thing that I've mentioned on a few shows before called cultural heritage, which, although it obviously ties in with football heritage in general, but it's a little bit different and a lot more misunderstood. And to be honest with you, not as obvious as the other heritage aspects that we actually touch on. And we're going to be doing this through the lens of research that Josh is currently conducting for his PhD, which is a really, really interesting study into football fandoms and cultural heritage in relation to post-industrial communities within the north of England. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just quite excited to be speaking with someone about cultural heritage a bit more closely, because that's obviously what I sort of done within my thesis for my master's degree a few years ago now. It's something that I've stayed pretty close to within my day job within heritage as well. So it's good to actually be speaking about this a little bit more within the context of football, because although I've touched on it so far in the podcast across different episodes, it's not something that I've been able to go too in depth with so far. And yeah, I mean, there's no better person to be talking about it than with yourself, Josh. So just before we get things kicked off properly, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and the work that you're currently doing?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the introduction. So, yeah, as you say, Rory, I'm Josh Bland. I'm doing just about finishing, hopefully, in the next 6 months, a PhD on sort of football fandom, specifically as cultural heritage. I'm based at the Cambridge Heritage Research Centre at the University of Cambridge. And I suppose that the sort of the background of the PhD is that I was someone who grew up as a football fan, sort of following West Brom home and away all around the country. And for me, football fandom was a sort of a lifestyle, something which really sort of defines my identity, my linkage back to the Midlands, which is obviously where I'm from, something that sort of binds my family together. And so I'd always understood football fandom as this completely embodied sort of day-to-day lifestyle. And then I've sort of gone away, did a history degree, and then a heritage master's, and then obviously started with the heritage PhD. And I think it became really clear to me that, I mean, cultural heritage, and I don't want to jump the gun by sort of going too deep into the theoretical conversation too early, but cultural heritage is something that I think traditionally has been understood as being very linked to sort of museums and heritage institutions and specific sort of physical artifacts and sites. But over the last sort of 20 years or so, there's been a much more of an emphasis on cultural heritage being sort of intangible, in inverted commas, being stuff that might be traditions or songs or styles of food, and incorporating those sort of lifestyle elements. And it was just really, really interesting to me to start considering football fandom as a sort of form of intangible cultural heritage, as something that was really, really important to the identity and to sort of community formation, sense of place, you name it, to various groups of people around the UK. And so really, really the kernel was that there's so much fantastic academia focused on football in sociology, in history, anthropology, psychology, but there's no one really, there's a couple of exceptions to that, but there's no one really who's properly done any research into football in the sort of field of heritage studies from that sort of cultural heritage perspective. So I was just really curious to start researching football as this sort of almost intangible cultural heritage, this sort of lifestyle which brings people a lot of meaning.
You're absolutely spot on in everything you've said there. I completely agree. I mean, even when I was doing my masters, it was quite stark, the amount of literature that didn't exist on exploring the culture around football and how that links to heritage. And the majority, it might be different now. So the last time that I kind of seriously looked at it was around 2022. But as far as I'm still aware, the majority of it still revolves around heritage and tourism and this kind of idea of a heritage tourism nexus, which, you know, is great. And there's other people who are going to be in the show before where that is their main focus of research. But where my interest lay was where these intangible cultural elements kind of came into play. And I suppose that's probably our best place to start, is the context of what cultural heritage actually is. And as you mentioned there, cultural heritage was largely, attributed to physical artifacts, museums, what is a person or a place or an item's culture. Whereas then it kind of took this shift towards different rituals, perhaps indigenous peoples who practice certain cultural, events, certain foods, as you mentioned as well, all these things that we can't really explain or know as being there, but nevertheless exist. Whereas now, moving away from that as well, it's began moving towards other aspects of intangible culture as well. For example, people that walk, certain walking routes and the cultural heritage that holds for people. There was ones that we studied that were like graffiti walls, climbing walls. Cultural heritage can be attributed to all these different things. And for me, where it really came into football was there is a ritualistic aspect to it. There are certain songs that are sung that are passed down through generation to generation. The stories that are told through generations, obviously we covered that on a recent episode. And really all of these different things that tie together that we can point back to our club's founding that have influenced us today and how it's influenced our upbringing, whether it be, being huddled around the television, watching certain games, knowing certain songs, but not really knowing where we learned them. Again, it just being this kind of thing that's passed down, but also knowing where we've come from a heritage and place perspective and being tied to our football clubs. So that's what it really means for me. But as the academic in the room, I suppose, can you explain the context of cultural heritage in football a little bit more in depth than that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think you've touched upon a couple of really important points there. And I suppose the first thing to say is that sort of intergenerational aspect. The way that I suppose define cultural heritage in a sort of in simple terms, and especially when I'm doing work with, I sometimes do a lot of outreach work at Cambridge with sort of sixth formers, and I think the best way into sort of trying to explain to them what heritage is almost like, I see it as like applied history almost. If history is the study of what happened in the past, then heritage takes the emphasis away on fact finding and puts it onto sort of present use. So to me, heritage is the way that people today use elements of their past for the benefit of an imagined future. And when you sort of define heritage like that, it incorporates all manner of different sort of tangible and intangible aspects, different artifacts, different traditions, rituals, you name it. Just to sort of very, very briefly sort of chart the development of heritage more broadly as well, because I think it is really important to specifically the way in which I sort of link cultural heritage and football together, is that heritage itself started, I suppose, is a complete product and sort of reaction to modernity in the same way that football is. In the same way that football itself was sort of birthed from the Industrial Revolution and the sort of the rapidly changing social context of the late 19th century, which is something that I know you talked about with John in a recent episode, a really, really good episode on his new book. Heritage itself, I suppose, started as a sort of in the preservationist movement, and a desire from people living in the sort of early Victorian era who were seeing their cities and the environment around them change quite quickly, and them wanting to almost freeze and preserve certain historic buildings and stop material change happening to the sort of the physical and built landscape around them. And because of that sort of origin, heritage is very Western, and it has historically been really, really linked to sort of material culture and physical sort of items, and specifically been concerned with preservation. But over the sort of course then of the 20th century, and especially sort of since the 80s and 90s, as a response to maybe sort of decolonization and a response to wanting to represent, as you said, sort of indigenous groups more, there has been a much greater emphasis on these more intangible traditions, and the fact that really, so much of heritage now is sort of defined by this tangible intangible divide. The fact that actually all heritage, the way in which we sort of make sense of ourselves and the way in which we use the past today, is almost all of it has both tangible and intangible elements. A football stadium, a football kit, a specific, a ball from an FA Cup final means something to us as heritage because of the intangible sort of practices that it represents, and because of the stories that it represents, and because of the lifestyle that it represents as well. So bringing, I suppose, all of that together, football as a culture is something that is so predicated on the stories we tell about our past. And it is, the way that I put it in my own research a lot is there's a wonderful word which is a palimpsest, which is almost like a piece of parchment which has been sort of layered over and written and rewritten and layered over. And that's how I sort of see football. Football is almost this build up of narrative and story over the course of 100, 150, 200 years, and so much of the meaning of football culture is rooted in the way that we as supporters sort of create stories and a sense of narrative, a sense of place, identity, and rootedness from this build-up of traditions and rituals and stories. And I hope that sort of begins to sort of drive at what I'm I suppose getting at with my research.
Yeah, I mean, you've nailed it perfectly. Again, I think one of the best examples I always go back to kind of explain this tangible and intangible sort of existence that a lot of our football finds itself in, and any other aspect of heritage really, is Cathkin Park. And it's a great one to go to because you've got this idea of a lost club, so there's a historic element to that as well. It's starting to fade from living memory, so there's a memory aspect to it, and there's an aspect where if you don't start collecting oral histories from people, then that will disappear from living memory completely. But you've also got the physical remnants of the stadium as well. Of course, we've all seen the photographs of the terracing going around this kind of deeply wooded area with the old safety crush barriers there as well. But then when you actually visit it, you get the feeling of what it would be to actually stand on that terracing as well. And although the surroundings of it has changed, there is still a feeling attached to it. And that's what cultural heritage is. And it comes into another concept that I've spoken about on this show briefly before called phenomenology, which is to truly understand something and to be able to explain it to people, you have to go and actually feel it for yourself, go to an area and actually begin to process the feeling of being there instead of, just reading and writing about it, which I think is very important in football as well.
Yeah, but on that phenomenology point as well, Rory, I mean, I think it's really important to emphasise that because obviously football culture and the way that you experience football is so based in sort of the multi-sensory sort of experience of being at the game and the sensory experience of you just sort of like moving through your week basically as a football fan. But that's what fundamentally I think makes capturing football both in writing and research really quite tricky, is that it is so based in the sensory and it's such a heightened sort of experience that it is, without experiencing it firsthand, as you say, or trying to use stuff like oral history to actually speak to people about this stuff, it's really, really difficult to try and capture the true essence of its meaning, I suppose.
It's true. It's difficult unless you actually go to a place or a stadium. Say, for example, like the Yellow Wall in Dortmund, just off the top of my head. How do you write that down and explain it to people without having been there? So they're all really important points, and ultimately this is what cultural heritage is and how it ties into football. It's not something that we are necessarily aware of until we are, I guess. Mm-hmm. Or if, like myself and Josh, like you'll go to different museums and different football games and obviously kind of know about it because we've studied it. But for the most part, it's the things that you know and that you engage in, but that you won't necessarily acknowledge as being part of culture, and there's different reasons for that as well. But largely,
100%.
Largely speaking, though, that's how cultural heritage interacts with football and how it plays a role in it. But where your research is more focused, Josh, kind of really drills down into the nitty gritty of place, how cultural heritage and football influences those places, particularly in post-industrial context, which within the context of football across the country is huge and is massively important.
Absolutely, yeah, and in some ways, I think me picking post-industrial contexts to research, as I suppose as my main case studies, is a product of two things. The first is that I myself am from a sort of post-industrial area, and sort of grew up around sort of the Midlands, around Birmingham, Coventry, supporting a team which is from, Albion are from a factory, and we are in a very, very obviously densely sort of industrial area. So that sort of sense of industrial heritage is something that weighs heavily and has weighed heavily on my own sort of football supporting experience. But the other thing was, and I suppose this is a slight detour, but it is sort of relevant, I suppose, to the origin of my research, is that a lot of the basis and the fundamentals of my research are actually sort of rooted in the new football regulator.
Okay.
And the fact that from sort of late 2020, early 2021, when they first published the findings of the fan-led review, they said that they wanted the regulator to protect football heritage without there being much in the way of research as to what that might look like. How do you go about protecting an intangible culture? And it's all very well saying, okay, we can protect stadiums and kits and crests and things like that. But to me, that's not good enough if you actually want to sort of bring about meaningful protection for sort of football culture as a whole. I'm not entirely sure just focusing on these sort of material things are actually is gonna sort of help you preserve it. So I wanted to find somewhere where I thought there was a particularly potent expression of the linkages between place, community, and football. And to me, there is no more powerful sort of narrative than you can find than the narrative of the post-industrial town, where in the absence of the industry that was once there and that once defined life in these towns, the football club has sort of become everything. And to me, the case study that I find most interesting from my PhD is a place, it's called Hordern.
Okay.
Formerly Hordern Colliery Welfare, but now Hordern Community Welfare Football Club. They've probably got a slightly heightened reputation across the country because it's the club where Colin Bell, sort of the Man City legend, first came through as a youngster. But it's a pit village. In 1900, Hordern was a farm. It had something like 20 people living there on the census. By 1940, once they'd sort of found the seam of coal in the North Sea nearby, it was 15,000 people living there. So this entire village basically grew around the presence of coal and the industry. And then obviously after the miners' strikes and deindustrialization under Thatcher, it completely devastated the town. I think 90% of the working population of Hordern at the peak of mining were all employed in the mine, and then the mine closed and it is completely devastated the town. It is one of the most sort of deprived, really, really sort of rough and impoverished places in the entire UK. But the thread of continuity against that massive sort of traumatic change has been the football club. And in the absence of strong trade union movements, in the absence of sort of strong educational provision, sort of community assets, in the absence of even of things like working men's clubs and social clubs and pubs, which are all closing down en masse, the football club has remained as this sort of solid thread of continuity for the locals, and it has taken on this incredibly important and central role in terms of basically keeping kids off the streets, giving educational provision, providing free clothing, sometimes free meals, and it has basically become this almost a mix of, it's a charity institution, it's a place for leisure, it's a place for Saturday escape, and it's a place for the locals to basically continue finding a narrative which is, as you say, linked to place, a way they can identify with Hordern in a positive way that isn't defined by that sort of loss of industry. So I just think that, as you say, these industrial places are particularly powerful in sort of understanding the relationship that a football club can have to a specific community in a specific place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack there, but it's a really, really interesting concept. And I want to go back to something that you said about the football regulator, first of all, because there's something that I just wanted to touch on, really, is that obviously they came out and said, we need to protect football heritage without really going into what that meant.
Yeah.
And that's quite important in itself, because a lot of kind of organisations and bodies and people are doing this kind of thing without really understanding what heritage is. And it becomes a bit of a bargaining chip. And it's kind of weird because you can obviously protect the physical aspects of football clubs, like you say, the material, whether that be kits, colours, badges, stadiums, etc. But where cultural heritage is concerned, culture is ultimately fluid, and it always has been fluid. Yeah. It's supposed to develop and supposed to grow. So therefore, how can you regulate something that is, one, intangible, but two, naturally has to grow and develop and adapt to how the game is? That comes out perfectly in the example that you've just mentioned. You have this town that began as a farm, became a pit village, was ravaged by deindustrialization, but the one constant has been the football club, and that football club will have had to adapt, and the culture of the people will have had to adapt as well, as they saw their shops, their homes, their pubs, all of these different social places closed down. The one remaining thing there is the football club. So that's an example of how this culture is fluid, and though it has to adapt around negatives in that circumstance, if a regulator came in and said, well, we have to protect this, what things and what restrictions are they then going to put in place to stop that from adapting? Do you know what I mean? So it's this kind of thing where you have to look at it from the perspective of football has always adapted, the culture around football has adapted, as have supporters, as have clubs, particularly at that level. So how can you actually regulate something? So, it's quite an interesting point that I wanted to touch on there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is something again, and I think this is certainly like a big enough topic for me to maybe even justify coming back on to talk about this, because this is something that I'm writing about in the minute, and I've got an article coming out over the summer in the Blizzard, which is specifically about this stuff, and I'm working on trying to figure out ways that I've got my findings from my PhD, which we'll talk about in a minute, but I'm sort of moving on to this next step of okay, what is that going to look like, and is it possible to regulate what is, as you say, a fluid, sort of intangible culture? I think the answer that I am increasingly sort of coming to is that I don't believe that just the heritage measures that they have sort of said, basically laid out in their sort of regulation and their policy are sort of misnomers. They're sort of invoking heritage as this sort of uncritically good, lovely, cuddly thing, which I'm a massive believer in the power of heritage, as I know you are as well, Rory.
Yeah.
But I think too often heritage is invoked in a very uncritical, very simplistic way.
Yes.
And just because you are going to be protecting, stopping Grimsby Town from changing their kit from black and white to orange or something, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to protect that club from a rogue owner being able to come in and completely change the fabric of that culture.
Correct.
Locally.
Yeah.
So what you need to be able to do is, and I think the only way that you can genuinely protect football heritage as we understand it is with meaningful fan representation. And that follows a sort of community heritage model, which you'll be familiar from your own work. Again, we can have a conversation about how practical implementing stuff like a golden share or fan boards, which with real power actually is in the context of the game.
Yep.
But the only way that you can actually protect a living and breathing culture is with the cooperation and input and guiding hand of the people who are involved in the communities which sort of live it. So it's to me, managing football heritage is less about top-down measures to protect specific things, and it's more about a much more integrated, fan-led, community-led approach. And I appreciate that is very sort of pie-in-the-sky thinking against the current context of football, but I do think that is the only way that you can probably protect heritage as we understand it.
I completely agree with you, and I think that's representative of a shift. If you kind of look to the late 70s, early 80s, when the maximum wage was removed from football in England, and everything started making this shift towards a more commercial approach, where it was really the club stopped being the driver of fan identities, cultures and values, and supporters groups did. Just to touch on what you mentioned about your research as well, one of the clubs that I focused on in mine was Clyde. And Clyde are quite interesting for me. And again, it ties into post-industrialisation, because Clyde really suffered from the slum clearances which really swept Glasgow in the 50s and 60s, because their stadium and the place that they were from, Shawfield, where they really drew their core supporter base from, was devastated by the slum clearances. And you can argue that wasn't necessarily a necessary evil, because there was a lot of disease and a lot of poverty in these slums, but they weren't rebuilt. The homes weren't rebuilt. People were moved away, and so the club support was literally decimated. And since Clyde moved out of Shawfield, I think that was the very late 80s, early 90s, they haven't had a permanent home. The club's support has dwindled. They were forced to move to a stadium in Cumbernauld. I mean, it's even outside Cumbernauld, or it was at the time, called Broadwood, which had nothing around it, not really any pubs, not any of the common eateries, none of the places that people would have commonly known. And now they're ground sharing with Hamilton, just down the road from me, whereas their spiritual home is in that kind of southeastern, I guess, corner of Glasgow. And it's weird, because now you've got 3 coming on 4 generations of supporters who have watched Clyde play somewhere different, but none of them really remember what Shawfield was like in terms of the things around it. And it just goes to show that the club have actually been in a bit of crisis in the last few years. They've had financial issues, and were at risk of dropping out of the league altogether and into non-league, which would have been devastating for them, because they're one of Scotland's most historic clubs. But for me, that proved that you can't successfully run a football club if you don't have roots in place. Hypothetically, if those slums weren't cleared and you still had all the same places that you would go pre-match, same spots you would stand with your friends at the game, if that was still there, would the support still be there? I argued yes, it would, because the club wasn't moved to this effectively soulless local authority ran sports bowl, which was multi-use, where no one could really get to. There wasn't really anything around it, and it wasn't Clyde. Do you know what I mean? So that kind of plays into it, as well as that people don't realise that when these places are cleared, when football clubs move from somewhere, they lose a part of themselves, and it's a part that they really, really struggle to hold on to and can struggle to adapt to.
Completely. And I think, like, one of the things that I am really, really big on, and I suppose this is one of my central arguments in the PhD thesis and in a lot of the writing that I've done sort of around the PhD, is that, and this sort of ties really into what you were just saying there, is this idea of continuity. Now, like, continuity is I think is the best way to express what I think a lot of people find valuable in football culture, because continuity does not necessarily mean that you can't change or adapt or shift, but I think it's really, really important for people to be able to draw a sort of recognizable thread, a sort of an intergenerational thread with their support of a specific football team, sort of backwards through time, and then again sort of being able to imagine that thread continuing into the future as well. And that really cuts to the core, really, of what I think cultural heritage is, which is this sort of thread of continuity through time, which sort of links past, present, and future. But I mean, like, again, speaking personally, for me, I'm a fourth generation Albion fan. So my great granddad, and then my granddad, then one of my parents have all been going to the Hawthorns. And of course, the Hawthorns as a sort of stadium space has changed drastically since 1900 when it was built. But having a sort of relatively consistent stadium experience, being able to go back to that same place, being able to drink in a lot of the same pubs that my family have always historically grown up drinking in, that has given me a really, really strong sense of home and connection and tie back to West Bromwich. Even though I've never lived in West Bromwich, I was born sort of in a sort of in Birmingham, and then I've variously lived in Tividale and a place called Nuneaton. So, like, I've never actually lived in West Bromwich, but West Bromwich will always feel like home to me because of that connective tie that I have back to the football club. And if I look at my sort of PhD work, I mean, the three clubs that I've worked with are Hordern, and then sort of moving up the leagues, Grimsby Town and Newcastle United. And I think for all three, there is such a strong link between place and the football club itself. And the football club is without question, especially in Newcastle, in the absence of the shipbuilding and the sort of heavy industry that traditionally defined what it was to be a quote-unquote Geordie, the football club has become the space in which people are actively negotiating what it actually means to be from Newcastle. Like, black and white has become like the official club. So the club colours have become the colours of the city. Like, I've done this thing in my research, which is not a particularly scientific method, but I've basically gone around and taken a photo of all of the businesses in the city centre which have got black and white sort of shirts in the windows, or I've taken photos, all of the road signs in the city centre, and the sort of tourist information, or the heritage sort of plaques are all in black and white, and you can almost map like how the club colours have sort of seeped into the general psyche of the city. So especially in these places which have had their very sense of identity shaken by deindustrialisation, football is such a brilliant way to sort of be able to almost live and act and perform a sense of place identity. And I really do not think you can understate how important football is in that sort of place identity formation.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, in terms of place building, community wealth building as well, but that's something kind of separate. But in terms of the place aspect, maintaining that sense of place, it really is understated. I mean, how many other phenomenon do you have where people are following the same roads and going into the same pubs and the same places to go to the same place to sing the same songs for 90 minutes every other weekend? Do you know what I mean? It is a phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon. Falkirk is another good example when they moved out of Brockville. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people with mixed views in this who say, oh, well, Brockville was a shithole, it was falling down, it needed replaced, and that's kind of a separate debate. You can do it up and things like that, but it was bang smack in the centre of Falkirk, 5-minute walk from the nearest train station. You had everything around it, pubs, etc. And then they moved their stadium out towards Grangemouth, not really around anything, surrounded by roads coming off of motorways and industrial estates and stuff like that. It's just there's no place there. The saddest thing about it for me is that, fair enough, if you're going to move from a stadium that's one thing, but there's still ways that you can preserve what once was, whether that's turning that old stadium into, a museum, again, wishful thinking, or something else which the community can use. But in this case, it's been turned into a Tesco. And it's like, people who've been to Brockville, what are they going to get by going back to that Tesco? Absolutely nothing. And it just contributes into this sense of loss. And going back to what you mentioned about Newcastle, not too far down the road, it was the same in Middlesbrough when Ayresome Park was closed, and that coincided with the loss of more jobs, with the industrialisation and the shipbuilding industry really going downhill. And this sense of loss erodes communities, it erodes place, and it severs people's links to their football clubs, I feel, as well, whether they've been a victim of this intentionally or not, or if they've chosen to move. It's something that ultimately weakens people's relationships with football clubs and leads to this loss of identity and loss of a sense of place, which, within deindustrialised communities is a massive issue at the moment, as you'll know.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what I've become really interested in, and I suppose this was never the intention. Well, I mean, I suppose when I picked Grimsby and Newcastle and Horden, the intention was really to tell quite a classic sort of sociological, historical story about big change, but a continuity, a smaller continuity against that wider context, which allows people to sort of keep a solid sense of identity and self and rootedness. But there's some really, really interesting nuances about that, which are specifically about loss as experienced through football. And there's a huge debate at the minute, obviously raging in Newcastle about St James's Park, and it really sort of divided different elements of the fandom, some of which who want to move, recognise the sort of the necessity to move in inverted commas, and others who absolutely don't want to move, and it is creating a lot of friction. I find football culture now, it's a really, really precious thing, and specifically in terms of commercialisation and touristification, and this is something that a lot of cultural heritage sites, especially stuff that gets listed as sort of UNESCO World Heritage, finding that balance of the right amount of commercialisation, the right amount of touristification, without sort of warping the meaning of that culture that you're trying to quote unquote protect as heritage, is often quite a fine line. And specifically at Newcastle, I mean, obviously at Grimsby and Horden, there's not a great tourist market of people going there. So you do find that because there's a real linkage between the club and the supporters base, then the club sort of are much more community facing. In Newcastle, that's a much more complicated story, because although the links between the city and the club are huge, and there is a huge and sort of loyal, a massive supporter base, not across the northeast in Newcastle, they are a truly global institution at this stage because of the success of the Premier League and because of the size of the club, and that is bringing a whole new sort of sense of loss and a whole new tension, whereby a lot of sort of what you might call traditional fans in inverted commas, who maybe gave up their season tickets under Mike Ashley, now can't get tickets to games and there's a huge demand for tickets because of sort of the club's new global reach and a growth in tourism. And so there's different threats that can come, that I suppose, that can threaten football clubs and change the meaning of culture. And again, I'd never want to fall into the trap of being a sort of a tub thumping sort of middle class white bloke going, well, football's my game. This is it's all because obviously like tourism and global interest in British football is a good thing, but there are different things that include stadium moves or the physical decay of like infrastructure, sort of touristification, commercialisation, that can all threaten that sense of continuity that I think is absolutely vital to English football meaning anything at all. And so it's a really interesting, I find that debate about touristification especially really, really, really interesting, because I don't know what the right answer is, basically.
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, there's some research that kind of comes to mind, which I looked at for mine, which was by one was by Zygmunt Bauman. I can't remember the name of the other guy, but one was called Time of the Tribes and the other was called Retrotopia. And one was about tribalism and how globalization and the erosion of what, as the things we just mentioned, the erosion of place, the erosion of identity has led to people effectively organising themselves into these little tribes, which are anti-globalistic, looking for something that isn't necessarily there anymore, and almost, fervently attached to nostalgia, without really being able to adapt or understand it. And it's because this idea of identity in place has been eroded. But something that you just mentioned there, Retrotopia, dives more into this nostalgia side of thing, whereas it kind of argued that we've hit a certain point where we can't necessarily go forward anymore because we've plateaued, so everyone starts to look back. And I think there is substance in that, particularly when you look at things like fashion and music. Everything kind of goes in this same cycle, but it's happened with football as well, where people are almost going back the way and looking to lower league teams and non-league as, being proper football, I say in air quotes. And there's problems with that as well, and it's not something that I necessarily agree with 100%, although I do think there is something there in it. But it's something that you've kind of done within your research and actually identifying and seeking out these hierarchies of authenticity. Now, authenticity is a huge thing, and I'm genuinely, it's such a central concept to the things that we're talking about here, and it really, really drives a lot of the research that you're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, like authenticity in some ways. I'm again, this is a sort of unintended consequence of the research that I'm doing, right? So I set out to tell this sort of slightly more Route One story, really just as an attempt to kick off the scholarship on football heritage. But I do think that this idea of authenticity is every thesis will end with the question, so what? What's next? And I think for me, like this exploration of authenticity is that what's next. And I think most football fans carry with them, especially football fans who are of a certain sort of and I'll again use this in the biggest inverted commas as possible, sort of traditional mold, who are maybe sort of have that intergenerational connection to a specific football club in a specific place, have the family links, have the place links, have that rootedness. There is a sort of prescribed, natural and proper way to be a quote real, authentic fan. You support the team that was either where you're from or the team that's been handed down by your family, because that's just what you do. And the correct thing to do is to be in the ground at the stadium to watch in person. And people are very, very familiar with these ideas of being a plastic fan or not being a real fan, especially connected to big clubs. Now, one of the things that I've found, and again, this is very specifically sort of rooted in Newcastle, that I found this. I think in the modern game, the kind of football fans that probably we are, Rory, I think we were probably both in that sort of more traditional camp, are being, especially at the elite level, maybe slightly more feeling a little bit marginalised. I think for most of football history, the match-going, working class, sort of and white as well, like fan has had sort of like a cultural monopoly. But that is being eroded at the elite levels of the game because it's now increasingly for a TV audience. There's much more touristification going on. And I think traditional fans feel themselves being pushed out and having less and less power. And so in turn, they sort of assert these sort of hierarchies of, well, this is what it is to be a real fan. And then that in turn sort of it counter authenticity almost to their marginalization, then sort of excludes other people who might be new to the game or from different ethnic minorities or female fans. They might not meet those sorts of standards of authenticity, and so they become excluded again. So it's this sort of loop down effect where the commercialization of the game at the top level then means that football fans in the traditional sense counteract that by trying to enforce what it is, these sort of standards of authenticity, which then marginalize people further down the food chain, and it creates this almost ripple effect of marginalization, I suppose, if that makes any sense at all.
It does, yeah, and it's quite important that fan authenticity is discussed, I think, because it's a bit of an intangible thing at the moment, but it's something that you see an awful lot about, but people aren't actually speaking about in depth. And it ties in, I feel anyway, that a lot of it ties in with club authenticity, which I'll speak about in a moment.
100%.
But in terms of the fan authenticity side of things, I mean, it's gone kind of nuts, and it does kind of come back to this thing where it's like, you saw the Barclays man trend, for instance, right? This is maybe a bit of a microcosm to look into it. That's exclusive to people who were born in a certain era and who were old enough to remember the Premier League when it was the Barclays, and it was all like, again, in air quotes, proper football, guys scoring goals from out the boxes, big lumps up front, the ball's just being humped up to them, and then, they're taking a pot shot from anywhere. And it's interesting how, with nostalgia and looking back at it, it's always the best bits that are coloured in, because you and I both remember that the Barclays Premier League, those were the exceptions and those were the best moments from it. Those aren't necessarily what define it, but then you're also taking new fans who are perhaps only interested in the Premier League as it is in its modern iteration, and they're looking at it going, well, what's this? We don't remember this. And then other people are saying, oh, well, you're not a proper fan. And although it's a little thing, these types of things are boundaries that people are putting up and doing what they perceive as protecting the game. But in actuality, what they're doing is just engaging in this really sort of tribalistic instinct where they perceive new supporters, tourist fans is a term that's thrown around a lot, as being a threat, where it's not necessarily a case, is it?
No, exactly. And it comes back to what we were saying earlier as well about football culture evolving and football culture needing to evolve. And quite frankly, it's an untenable position, I think, to to sort of argue that football wants to go back to how it was during the Barclays era. I want football to be a sort of open and tolerant, progressive game. And I think at its best it can be and is. It's just trying to manage the change. And in some ways you want to try and treat it as almost like a common resource and try and have those different stakeholders, stakeholders with a slightly deeper historical connection to the club, the newer fans who are coming into the game, ensure that that tradition is being respected and the changes are being managed in such a way that that sense of continuity isn't completely ruptured. Because you have to, again, I come back to this idea that like football basically gets most of its meaning and its lore and its narrative from its history. So it's trying to keep that sort of candle lit without being exclusionary, and it's a really really difficult thing. And again, it's very very difficult to know exactly how to sort of manage it.
Exactly, and I think in terms of club authenticity as well, it's kind of strange because you see clubs, Manchester City, I suppose, again, probably being the best example, where previously, with Main Road, with how the club used to be pre-takeover, you'd probably look at them and think of them as a really traditional and historic club. They're far removed from that now, and you'd probably think of them as, or people would certainly perceive of them as being the least traditional and least authentic club because they've been, so bankrolled, stadium's always empty, the fan experience is pretty dull. And it's just strange how fluid it can be, and how are Newcastle going to end up going this way, for instance? Are other clubs that are bought going to go this way? And it is interesting that the authenticity, when you gain it, is something that you can lose as well, and people often forget that where club football is concerned.
Yeah, I mean, again, like with the PhD that I've been doing, because I've gathered sort of so much data that you're finding constantly that I'm finding all of these little subplots within the sort of the interviews and oral histories that I've done. And one of the most interesting subplots is the fact that at Horden, every single one of the supporters that I interviewed at one point had been a season ticket holder. So, I mean, Horden is I should mention this earlier, it's in County Durham. It's between Sunderland and Hartlepool. And every single supporter that I had interviewed had at one point been an active fan, most of them season ticket holders, at either Sunderland, Hartlepool, or on a couple of them Newcastle. And they had sort of pretty much abandoned sort of the bigger clubs en masse because they didn't recognise the game. For them, that thread of continuity that was going to the Stadium of Light, for what I said, this is a quote that I remember so vividly. One of the interviewees said that when I was a kid, I could feel that sense of connection. That Roker Park, being in Roker Park,
Yeah.
it felt like a recognisable experience that my granddad would have had when he was working in Sunderland building ships and stuff. And over the course of the last decade or so, as ticket prices have skyrocketed, as it became 45 quid to watch Sunderland play in League One, that sense of connection, that sense of continuity, that thread was warped and broke, and he, to the point where he no longer recognised the game. And I think football and that thread of continuity has a certain tensile strength. It has the ability to deal with a certain amount of change, but when I think fans feel like they're being taken the piss out of, or there is these huge ruptures like a stadium move, especially moving from a stadium as historic as Roker Park, for some fans it becomes too much and that thread of continuity breaks. And most of the people who go to Horden games, they get an average gate of about 200 people. They're mostly fans from the other northeastern clubs who have found that modern football, especially modern elite football, is just not recognisable to them as the sport that they grew up loving. And so they have refound that. Their support of Horden in some ways is less tribal, attached to a club. It's more support of a general sense of nostalgia for a footballing landscape and I suppose a footballing heritage that just sort of chimes with them. And they can refine that connection, ironically, and refine that sense of continuity at a completely different club. And so I suppose it sort of reinforces what I was saying right at the top of the program, which is I'm really, really interested in football fandom as this sort of lifestyle. Because what I found in Horden was that the people there were very, very connected to a lifestyle, to the point where actually switching allegiances, they were able to re-establish that sense of continuity and re-establish that sense of intergenerationality and that sense of thread, which they'd lost, I suppose, in the modern game.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said about this idea of the modern game versus what is lower league football, and again, it's a discussion for another time. But it does, I mean, it plays a huge role in our research ultimately because of these ideas surrounding authenticity, the different issues that clubs face when, if they can't get a season ticket for what they would call their big club, this smaller club might see a benefit. Do you know what I mean? So it's interesting how people kind of have a ranking system within their head of how they see clubs as being particularly authentic, how they see them as might being closer to what they imagine their football experience being. So yeah, it's interesting how heritage and concepts surrounding heritage play their part in all this. And one of the things that you have kind of sought to implement, or you've certainly asked the question on, is should there be an authorised discourse on football heritage, whether that writes itself into legislation or otherwise?
Yeah, so I suppose the way in which I've come to sort of authorise discourse is from a position of my sort of disciplinary background is a strand of heritage studies called critical heritage studies. It's basically a examination of the ways that people use heritage. So it's basically looking at the different ways that people use the past as a device of power or as a political tool. So it's trying to introduce and explain why certain politicians or organizations like UNESCO or nations, sort of local governmental bodies, might be using and promoting a certain element of the past in order to achieve some sort of political end. So one of the great examples of this is looking at like the Victorian Museum and how they were sort of codified and organized so as to prove the biological and racial purity of the white Western man, for example. And so that is like a classic example. The really key theory within critical heritage studies is from a scholar called Laura Jane Smith, who talks about what are called authorized heritage discourses. An authorized discourse is essentially one specific interpretation of history that is promoted so as to become dominant within a political organization or within a country, for example. And the most obvious examples to this are to look at sort of big sort of like dictatorships, for example, who often, like Mussolini in Italy, promoted a very specific interpretation of Italian history through school curriculums in order to try and brainwash his subjects into sort of protecting and consolidating his rule. So it's how different organizations with power use specific interpretations of history to consolidate power or for some sort of political end. Now, I am a big believer in there being a sort of football authorised heritage discourse which is promoted by TV broadcasters in the Premier League. And this is very specifically within an English context, and you'll have to enlighten me, Rory, if you feel the same with the SFA up in Scotland. But I feel like the Premier League, and it's through very subtle means, through the fact that stuff like statistics given about football now are never go before 1992, or the fact that basically the Premier League is presented as this very sort of unproblematic export success, and that it's become this huge global phenomenon, but none of the sort of distortive financial elements of the Premier League or the massive financial inequality between the leagues is ever really promoted through these sort of broadcast channels. And I'm trying to sort of develop a theory, I suppose, of whether or not, and see whether the Premier League and these broadcasters are promoting very sort of specific elements of the footballing past in such a way where it does become this sort of authorised discourse where everyone loves the Premier League. It's this unproblematic, wonderful thing that has transformed English football into the great powerhouse of the Western world. Now, obviously, the flip side to that is where this authenticity stuff comes in, where I think my theory is that through the promotion of this sort of specific understanding of football history, the Premier League and Sky have sort of helped to consolidate their own power over the game, and that is what is marginalising more traditional fan groups, and that is in turn why they are trying to impose their own ideas of what it is to be an authentic fan. And it comes down to this idea, which is completely central in any sort of heritage, which is this idea of dissonance, the idea that there is always going to be more than one interpretation of the past, and those interpretations will often be, they might complement each other, but they might be sort of working against each other and fighting against each other. And it is sort of through the interpretation of the past that you can almost understand and track where power relations lie in any given society or in any given political organisation. So that is your sort of, I suppose, whistle-stop tour of critical heritage studies in a footballing context.
Yeah, it is quite important though. It's like you said. So with the Premier League, actually, the example you use is perfect because, and like I said earlier on, within authorised heritage discourses, I think it's important to emphasise that the point of these is that they colour the best bits in and leave out the rest of the stuff that either isn't relevant or might be detrimental to the argument they're trying to make.
Exactly.
So if we were to have an authorised football heritage discourse, then it would probably include elements that, for ourselves, I mean, you could almost argue that one is beginning to form or has already taken shape here with how people are looking at, proper football or Barclaysmen and things like that. So the foundation is already there, but I suppose our aim would be for it to be much more, conceptually based and based in, well, actually, we're not talking about things like how people scored goals from outside of the box in the Barclays. We're talking about things like protecting the elements of football clubs that can be taken away by rogue owners, etc., etc.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and I think as well, like, it's really interesting because I suppose in my own work, the reason that a sort of an authorised heritage discourse is authorised is because there is an element of power behind it. And the reason that it is authorised is because someone has the power to authorise it. Now, like, so far in my research, I hadn't necessarily thought of sort of football fans themselves as being the authorising institution, because ultimately at the minute, I don't think fans have a huge amount of power, certainly at least in elite football. But I've been coming at it from the position of the leagues and the broadcasters are probably the ones who are forming authorised discourses, and then the fans are maybe resisting or coming up with alternative interpretations which are ultimately sort of grassroots or from below or against the grain. But I suppose the question about authorised discourses in the context of football is really the ultimate question of who has power in a footballing context. And to me, in an ideal world, if there are to be authorised discourses of heritage to be had in football, I would love it to be the fans themselves who are sort of defining these sorts of authorised discourses, and I would love it for us to be in a position where the fans themselves do have the power to be pushing the agenda of and deciding what elements of the footballing past they want represented. So in some ways, like, I suppose having fan-led authorised discourses is like a really, really aspirational goal of mine, and it comes back to what I was saying earlier about the regulation. Like, if we can enshrine proper fan power and representation in football regulation, which we have an unprecedented opportunity to do with the IFR, then I think we would get much closer to a step where we do have a much more balanced and a much more wholesome and a much more productive sort of representations of football history in the mainstream, which I think would be fantastic.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. It's something that I think like you said, with the regulatory body kind of looking at all of these different aspects, it's something that we do have an opportunity to actually jump on. And it would be great if something like that existed. But, at the end of the day, and part of the reason for this project was to raise awareness of the existence of heritage within football, whether that be physical or intangible. And that in itself is a response to the fact that a lot of football heritage is actually just being, swept away completely. Particularly for me, where stadiums are concerned, when you remove a building, you don't just remove the physical aspect of it. You also take away a place where people met up. You also take away the stories and the memories that people have attached to those places. So, there's different aspects within it in that as well. Just before we finish up, Josh, what are your plans for your future research? Because this is obviously a huge project that you've undertaken. Surely you have to put your feet up at some point.
Yeah. Oh, well, I wish. So the plan for me, I mean, the plan is basically for me to become a career academic. So I'm due to submit my PhD. I've got a year to write up, but it's looking like I might even be able to submit. I'm cursing it now. I'm saying it in public. It looks like I might be able to submit by the summer a little bit early. So ideally, I might have a little bit of a rest at the back end of summer. But I've got a lot of irons in the fire. I'm looking at a couple of postdocs. I've got a couple of sort of soft offers to go away and carry on my research into football, specifically in industrial places, but really focus on these issues of authenticity and authorized discourses. So that is something that I'm looking at. Then in terms of writing for sort of popular audiences, I run my own Substack, just a sort of like a little weekly newsletter on sort of themes which are adjacent to my research, which is called Against the Run of Play, which I would, if you got, I know most of the people listening will be readers of the brilliant sort of Football Heritage website, and if you think you've got space for any more similar writing, then I would recommend my Substack as a good place to start.
For sure.
And I'm working on a sort of as I finish writing the thesis, I am working on a popular version of my thesis to be released as a sort of a popular book in bookshops. So as I come back on the podcast, I can update you on the progress of that as well. And then finally, my ridiculous life, I have just started a position as director of research at a organisation called the Deep Creative, with the wonderful Ed Norval, who is obviously a Football Heritage alumni. Ed Norval, who I know has been on the podcast, and we are sort of offering a service to football clubs, really to try and get them to understand their own heritage and their own identities as clubs and better connect with their fans. So we're going into football clubs and sort of working on a consulting basis to try and help them build their heritage profile and to better connect with their fan bases. So yeah, lots going on. Sort of academic research is the main thing, but a lot of writing and a lot of sort of practical applications to my research as well. So it's a very exciting time.
Absolutely, it's a very busy time as well. But I think for me, the best part of that is that you're bringing it to a popular audience as well, because
exactly.
One of my pet hates is that so much of academia is inaccessible to just regular people, whether that's because of price, whether it's because of the language used. So I think bringing it to a popular audience is fantastic, and it's something that really helps spread the word and the ideas of like ourselves, like Ed as well. And the work that we're doing to try and actually promote and help this push towards understanding and preserving football heritage. And of course, we're really looking forward to working with the Deep Creative more to bring the stories of what you guys are actually doing inside football clubs, and the things that you've done in terms of researching their history and helping people engage with them more, because I think those are really important stories as well. Josh, thank you very much for joining us on this podcast. It's been an absolutely phenomenal episode. As I said at the very beginning, it's great to speak with someone about cultural heritage again and literally just kind of bounce all these ideas off of each other.
Absolutely. And just to say back at you, I think, the work you guys are doing at Football Heritage is superb. And I'm just really pleased that there's a group of us now forming who are really taking this subject matter seriously. And I think I think this is a growing movement within the game, which I think is only going to get stronger over the next few years. So can't wait to work with you more.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Just as a kind of small side note on that, I suppose some notable mentions, particularly to Terrace Edition and Glory Magazine, who might not realise it, but with the photography work that they're doing and the prints that they're putting out and actually covering and bringing attention to the culture of the game in different places, I think can't be understated either. And any other works that are doing similar to that as well. But that'll do us for tonight. Thank you very much once again for coming on, Josh. Of course, if there are any questions you want to ask about tonight's episode, if there's anything that you want to approach us with that you might want to talk about, whether it's conceptual, whether it's about a club or a player, just anything that's related to football history or heritage, then please do get in touch. You can DM us on X or BlueSky, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. But for now, Josh, say goodbye.
Cheerio.
It's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.